Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first Wednesday episode of the semester. I'm really excited to welcome Ashley Parker, first year MArch student who has a background in psychology and has done a lot of work, like kind of long-term research related to neuroscience, and Ania Jaworska, clinical assistant professor, whose work often engages ideas of comfort and seeing things differently, maybe in ways you don't necessarily expect. So we thought that they would make a great match for this Two How-Tos kind of event on how not to perceive, or how to not perceive, excuse me. And yeah, with that, I will let them take it away, Ania and Ashley.
All right, thank you, Jane, for the introduction. We had actually planned introduction, but we're gonna skip it probably now. So, well, first of all, thank you all for being here. And I just wanted to mention that this is a presentation. This presentation is a loose record of conversations we had with Ashley for the past month or so about our individual interests and fascinations in the fields of psychology and architecture. Which this presentation will focus on perception and mental and visual errors of our perception.
Yeah, look away.
All right, that's going to be a little bit of a struggle here, I'm sorry. Okay, Ashley, let's first start with video.
Perfect.
This is an awareness test.
Oh, no.
How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
The what? Okay, so as you can see, attention is a lot like a flashlight. You can see very clearly what you're looking directly at, but everything else is left in the dark. So this leaves a lot of room for mistakes and errors to occur. And one of the things that really stood out to me in my undergrad were the ways in which human perception is fallible, something that Ania and I had a great time talking about over the last month or so.
Yeah, so we're discussing, and I asked Ashley, what is perception?
Perception is how we use sensory information like light, sound, touch, taste, and smell to build an internal representation. So for example, if you see a red balloon, we're really encountering light waves that are picked up by little sensors in the back of our eyes. And these are then translated into an electrochemical language that our brain then formulates the image of the balloon. So previously, scientists thought we looked around and perceived the world in a very straightforward way. But perception is really an active process that involves memory, the aperture of attention, like we saw in this video, and pre-existing notions about the world. So we might perceive the balloon, but the internal image is altered by what we already know about it. This is such a strong connection that it's more accurate to say that our brains have images that are corrected by sensory input from the world. So perception then can be a lot more ambiguous depending on what you think and believe. So in this image, for example, both these people understand the granular parts of the visual stimulus like contrast, saturation, and movement. They know they're looking at a number, but the meaning is different for each of them because of where they are in space. So this situation might even be more intense if it was 2020 again, and the 6 represent a Republican and the 9 represented Democrat.
So I guess we were talking about how is it possible that we make such errors as not seeing the moonwalking bear in the video, or as this image indicates, having two completely different opinions about what we see.
Yeah, this is interesting. We make a lot of mental shortcuts, and these are called heuristics, and they're generalizations or rules of thumb we use to make judgments about things and people and places. From an evolutionary point of view, they reduce mental effort so we can make really quick decisions for survival. And most of the time, these rule of thumbs work really great. We avoid risky environments like the middle of the street at rush hour. We pet baby animals because they're kind of harmless. We know what to do with an ice cream cone when we see it, and we know that dogs are good and cats are bad. Just kidding. Cats being worse than dogs would be a bias. And bias and heuristics are really close together and difficult to tease apart, but generally a heuristic is a strategy we use to reduce complexity, while bias is more like a favorite shortcut we use to make judgments that value certain ideas and information over other ones that are of equal merit. Both of these are done totally subconsciously, and it's really difficult to notice when we are taking a mental shortcut or playing favorites when making important decisions.
So actually, do these shortcuts or biases impact the way we see?
Yes, they do. A very famous example is a really simple and obvious one, the light from above bias. This is so obvious to us, but we always assume that the sunlight is coming from above, where the sun is usually at. This bias is so ingrained that when we do not have a light source, like in this image, we still imagine light from above to determine shape and depth. So like the circle on the left is read as convex because the light's on top, as compared to the circle on the right with the light below. But even this straightforward shortcut is impacted by really subtle things. So in this picture, what circle pops out to you as different than the rest? It's usually that upper left-hand corner. Yeah, that's because we have a bias of light from above, but we also have a leftward bias. So we favor things in that left upper corner of our vision. But if you look down at the lower row all the way to the right, you can see there's a difference in the last circle in relationship to the others. So this perception of whether you notice the left one or the right one actually depends on whether or not you read right or left. So Arabic or Chinese speakers who read characters from right to left, they notice the one on the right side first before the left. So our perceptions are impacted by obvious things like the sun being overhead all the time, but then also by less obvious things like culture or the way we read. This is a very, very old picture. This shows us how our perceptions can be affected by priming. Priming is when you have previous interactions with a stimuli that biases your perceptions. It sets you up to see something different. So if it's Easter time, people report seeing the rabbit over the duck. Compared to October, they're seeing more of a duck. And perception is also impacted by context. So I'll give you a moment to see what you can gather from this picture. You may or may not have seen it. I don't know if anyone would like to venture a guess, but. Okay, so it's a Dalmatian. And as you see the Dalmatian, I wonder if you can kind of pick out the tree on the left side and the ground where it's sniffing. This illusion was posited by Richard L. Gregory, who founded the Psychological Journal of Perception. And you can see how once you know what you're looking at, everything falls into place and you can't unsee it. So one last final one. This picture looks really weird and we're not sure why. And that's because your brain's actually filling in information to make this make sense. So I meant earlier that you have an image inside and you're shaping the data coming in to fit the image that you already have. This is a perfect example. The legs are in the wrong space and the spaces are in the wrong place. Yeah. So ultimately, our brains are inference-making organs, comparing and contrasting our preconceived notions to external data, often favoring the internal representation more than what you're actually seeing. So in this way, we create our own subjective reality. What's even more scary and probably, it's interesting and scary at the same time, is that an individual's internal construction of reality, not the subjective, will make really important decisions. So these next couple of slides are about heuristics, and these were really explored in the 1980s. This first one is called the availability heuristic. And it's where things that come to mind more easily are believed to be a lot more common and more accurate reflections of the world. So this affects our ability to make estimates. So you see in this picture, these people are reading the newspaper and it says shark death, second shark death in 5 years. Oh my gosh, front page. People are swimming and they're judging them, thinking that they're in this line side of danger. But what is actually the #1 cause of death in not just the US, but in also the world? It's heart disease. So if you were to estimate probabilities here, these two folks actually are more at risk than the people swimming in the water. So the next one is called the anchoring effect. And this is how we anchor on ideas and adjust from that anchor. Adjustments from an initial anchor point take a lot of mental effort. We tend to stay around the initial value and overlook any actual value, even if it's just arbitrary numbers like picked at random. So in other words, we put an anchor down and all negotiations, all estimates, arguments, valuations, they're all hashed out with the original anchor in mind. So in this picture, this guy is really excited because he bought a fox for a stuffed fox for $4,500 as compared to the anchoring price of $5,000. But this totally overlooks the idea and the fact that this guy's fox's eyeballs are all out of whack. Something's going on. So the last final one is called confirmation bias. There's a few more beyond this, but these are really important 3 to remember. And this is a bias in which we tend to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs. So here this guy is reading a book on how the world is definitely flat. He's also wearing a pin that says he's part of the Flat Earth Society. But if you notice around him, he's in a library. There's tons of books on the solar system. There's a round globe. He has all this indication that things are round, but he doesn't see it. So as we saw in our, we have selective attention, and it takes a lot of effort to look for things that you don't know or believe. We get this cherry picking effect when we search out information, interpret the information, and then later recall the information in a way that supports our existing beliefs. This is seen in politics, finance, professional fields, lawyers, doctors, researchers, and yes, architects. All of this is a kind of motivated reasoning that's thought to be evolutionary adaptive because reality matching in the survival, and that can be irregardless of actual truth.
So I'm wondering, for a second, if it's only me that it's breaking up, or...
Oh, no.
Am I? No?
It was, yeah, I noticed a little bit too, but I
Not too
think
much.
for me it was mostly fed. Yeah, just a tiny bit, Ashley. No worries.
So I just wanted to get into
Okay.
the next step of our presentation and let us know if something is not clear. Because we wanted to make a statement that, or a question, I had a question. So can we say that our biases act like illusions?
Yeah, I think bias is like living in an illusion but not knowing it. And that's why I think it's so important to understand heuristics and how illusions play with your expectations so you can understand how to not make errors. So the research on heuristics is sort of like doing the same thing as an illusion. It's like revealing the magic tricks of our cognition.
So when we were discussing this subject with Ashley, and kind of the topic of perception, I started to research graphic illustrations that have been present within our culture for a while. They're always available in a Google search, and they're always so beautiful and puzzling and stunning. So I asked Ashley, what's happening in here? How come do they work?
This one is a really cool discovery. Yeah. This is a great discovery on how color perception works. So if you notice, the circle on the left is a little bit more green, while the circle on the right is a little bit more orange. But on closer inspection, we discover that these are actually, in fact, the same color. So if you remember back from science class, there are two different photoreceptors on the back of your eyes, rods and cones. Rods are sensitive to levels of contrast, cones are sensitive to color. So we have a trichromatic theory of color that describes how all colors can be added together to make any color. Cones on the back of your eyes also respond to color in this additive way. So say you have a combination of red light waves and blue light waves in the air, they tickle the back of your cones, the back of your eyes in different amounts, say 60% red and 40% blue, which then you perceive as purple. So if you look again on the circle on the left, see how there are a lot of bars of cyan, that blue-green color? The cyan paired with the yellow circle is all added together so that the circle appears more lime. But the one on the right has a lot of red bars through the circle. So red and yellow added together give you the perception that it's orange. The weird thing about trichromatic theory is that it doesn't work every time. In fact, we can't add together green and yellow. Technically we can to make, green and red to make yellow, but we don't ever perceive a reddish green. So this next one us to understand the second theory of color, which is the opponent process theory. So I'll have you stare at the screen. I'm not 100% sure this will work on a small screen, but if you can make it as big as possible or like lean in and stare at it, the center black dot, and we'll do, just hold your eye gaze there for about 15 to 30 seconds. And there's gonna be a magic trick. Okay, I think you're baked enough. Okay, close your eyes and keep them closed for about 10 seconds. And just notice what you see in the back of your eyes. You might have sort of this after image of the American flag, but where the yellow was, the blue is at, and then the stripes are red and the black stripes are white. Work? Hopefully, okay. So trichromatic theory doesn't explain perceptions of certain colors like greenish red or bluish yellow, and it also doesn't explain why you reliably see red after staring at blue for a while, or black after staring at the sun, which I do not recommend. So in 1892, Ewald Herring proposed the opponent process theory. And in this theory, color is really coded in opposite pairs of blue and yellow, red and green, and black and white. Some of our visual neurons are excited by blue and turned off by yellow, while others are excited by yellow but turned off by blue. So you see the green is red, black is white, and yellow is blue because you have stimulated one set of pairs until they become so fatigued that you begin to perceive the opposite pair. This is totally against the way that we actually understand the world, and so it took a really long time for people to believe this. But it turns out that actually trichromatic theory works, the additive theory works at the level of your receptors in your eyes, while opponent process theory works on a higher up level of your visual processing system. Again, your brain is constantly making shortcuts, and that's basically what it's doing with opponent process theory.
Yeah, so I've been personally looking at the robotics illusion that I think we also all know very well. And so I wanted to maybe follow up with Ashley's explanation of the color theory. And so if you notice, this image is static. It only rotates because you are perceiving it rotating. And I hope it rotates on your side of the computers as well. So it is in motion, but you can also notice that the disks, they rotate always in the same direction, meaning there are some that are rotating counterclockwise, the other ones rotating clockwise. And then so this false motion is always in the same direction as it ends up. And it follows order of colors: black, blue, white, and yellow. That's very specific. And so if you look at the image directly, or if you maybe squint your eyes, you probably will see that the discs stop. And then when you open your eyes again or blink rapidly, they will rotate again. So that was quite interesting to me. And then Ashley also talks a little bit about the photoreceptors and how they stimulate color.
Yeah, this is again kind of an idea of neurons being stimulated and then becoming fatigued. So if you notice the alternating color bands they're next to black and white bands, and you have two different rods and cones. Rods are perceptive to black and white or contrast, and cones are perceptive to color. And so each rods and cones are both recognizing things and fatiguing at different rates. And that ratio of fatigue and stimulation, it then triggers motion receptors in your eyes to perceive motion.
Yeah, so the next really interesting one, a bit trippy, is this pretty beautiful graphic that appears to be waving, but it really is static. And maybe a little more subtle one, if you look at the grid, the blue grid, and notice that there's probably dots popping back and forth on the intersections of the grid. So I was interested, where are all those images coming from? Because I always assumed it was part of the internet. And obviously I was very wrong. A person responsible for developing most of those visual illusions that we are familiar with is this Japanese professor of psychology at Kyoto University. His name is Akiyoshi Kitowaka. And here he is photographed with Lady Gaga. He designed his cover for her album, and I thought it was so appropriate.
So we've seen contrast interacts with our eyes, and that the aperture of attention focuses on what you're interested in, including and excluding information to develop a cohesive perception of 3D space.
So we're going to maybe shift a little bit into entertainment. So I wanted to introduce you to this American scientist, Adelbert Ames, who was a research professor of psychology in the 1940s and 50s. And Ames used the illusion to show the inherent ambiguity behind our perception. So this particular movie that I will play is from 1951. And actually, it's quite long. The information in there can be explained in 4 minutes now. But I will play a short that shows an experiment with a chair. And I'm pretty sure most of you are familiar with this effect. And then after that, I'll play a few more videos that are a little bit more modern. But please, sit back and relax and prepare for this unforgettable experience.
The three-chair demonstration is an assembly of 3 compartments. Each compartment has a small hole through which you can see the contents. In the back, the compartments are open. For the demonstration, you are invited to look through the hole in compartment 1. This is what you see. Next, number 2. And now, number 3. Now, let's go to the back and look in the compartments from this point of view. This is compartment 1. Now, look in number 2. And now, number 3. This is a chair, now viewed from above.
So this next video will show Ames's window experiment. And I hope that you will find in this video the real window that the person will be talking about, really a work of highest architectural value. And this one is a few minutes long.
though your brain is more remarkable than the most powerful computer in the world, it is possible to trick that very brain of yours. Have a look at this. What can you see? Oh, you say that's easy. I can see a window going around. Is it rotating or no? It paused. Now it's going the other way. Okay, so we're watching a window that's going backwards and forwards. Pauses again. Now it goes back the other way. Backwards and forwards all the time, oscillating. Are you sure that's what you're seeing? In fact, you're looking at an optical illusion that was invented by Albert Ames back in 1951, and it's quite a remarkable illusion. If we stop the window now, you'll notice that it was rotating the same direction all the time on a turntable, same way all the time, but it isn't a rectangle. You assumed that it was a window, so it must be a rectangle. Oh, no, it isn't. Look at that end there, quite short. This end, quite large. In fact, it's a trapezoid. A trapezoid, a strange shape, not a rectangle though. But because we've seen so many windows in our lives, we assume that they're all rectangular. Let's have a look at a real window. Your brain was forced to make a choice in that illusion between seeing a rectangular window going backwards and forwards or a trapezoid rotating, and you chose the rectangular window. You knew that whenever you look at a rectangular window that has cross pieces, you can see not only the fronts of those cross pieces, but also the sides. You may even see shadows underneath some of the cross pieces. But you've seen so many of these windows that you know all the time they'll be rectangular. And you can see that I've painted this window on a flat piece of cardboard to look like a real window. In fact, I've painted the cross pieces so that they appear to be three-dimensional. I've even painted in the shadows that you might get if you had a light from above. Okay, now you know it's an illusion. You know it's not a window, it's a flat piece of cardboard. You also know that it's a trapezoid, it's not a rectangle. So now the illusion won't work with you, will it? Or will it? Have a look at it again. Well, this really is quite crazy, isn't it? We know all about the illusion now. It shouldn't work on us, and yet it's still done. We still see the window going backwards and forwards. Look at that. It's appearing to pause now, and now change direction and go back the other way. Even though we know, because we've seen it on the turntable, we know that it's rotating in the same direction all the time. Well, I think the problem is we don't have a reference point. What we need to do is to attach something to the window, so we'll stop it now and attach a matchbox to one end. We'll attach it to the short end here with a paper clip. And then all you need to do is to watch that matchbox and use that as your point of reference. So this time the illusion won't trick you, or will it? Watch this. Now there's the matchbox going around the back of the window. Keep watching it. Now look what happens. The window appears to pause and go backwards, but the matchbox keeps coming and floats out past this edge of the window and rejoins the other edge of the window. Watch it again. Goes around the back, firmly attached to the window, you can see that. But here's the crazy part. The window appears to stop, to pause, and then go backwards, but the matchbox just keeps on coming, floating through space. I think maybe the problem is we have our reference point attached to the window. Let's stop it.
All right.
Lights,
Next, classic.
camera, perception. When you were little and some big kids pushed you around, did you ever fantasize about becoming bigger all of a sudden? Well, I did, and now I can, at the Exploratorium, San Francisco's Science Museum. How did I do it? The easy way, by manipulating your perception. When you first saw me, I appeared to be normal size because you couldn't see the rest of the room. But as the lights came up and the camera pulled back, your brain performed a new instantaneous analysis. It now saw me as small. It added up all the visual information it had about my size and the size and shape of the room. And then it added in everything it knew from experience about the usual shape of rooms, that they're rectangular and have right angles. So when I walked over here, your brain was convinced I was growing incredibly large because there was no other perceptual explanation, even though it wasn't logical. Let's look at it again, only this time from a different perspective. The room is not rectangular at all. It's totally distorted. There are no right angles anywhere. So that makes this clock, which is large and oval, look the same as that clock, which is small and circular, from your other perspective. The floor slopes upward, and as you can see, the ceiling slopes downward. So I'm not getting larger at all. You're just misperceiving my size because you think that you're the same distance from me when I'm over here as you are from me when I'm over there. But in fact, I'm twice as far away.
So yeah, the Ames's room illusion, I think it's probably one of the most powerful examples that let us understand that our brain is never perfect and is full of errors. And oops, I wanted to say that the Ames's room illusion and the window illusion is very often used in movies, in the movie industry and art. And I think Michel Gondry is known for using a lot of those perspectival illusions. And in architecture, we're definitely familiar with forced perspective. So here's another classic video.
Hidden in the secret garden of the Palazzo Spada in Rome is a folly created to fool the eye. A perspective colonnade designed by 19th century architect Francesco Borromini and known as the Borromini Corridor. Expanding a very limited space by means of perspective geometry, this three-dimensional vision isn't really what it seems to be. As the monk reaches the back of the corridor, the trick of scale is revealed and the illusion falls apart. His head towers over the tops of the columns. And here I am, the wrong size. This is how short I need to be to make the illusion work. The colonnade is meant to seem more than 60 feet in length, but in reality, it's only 24 feet long, less than half of what it seems to be. When scrunched to its actual size, the ceiling drops and the floor rises, reflecting the forced perspective needed to carry out the illusion.
I think that gets the point across. And when we were talking, I thought that, Ashley was also very interested in the connection between the perception bias and architecture and art.
Yes, I also find it really interesting. So here we have Julio Romano's Palazzo del Te in Mantua, and he built this in 1530, where he challenged the idea that a window had to be looked through. He essentially created a blind window, and we see this as kind of obvious, but at the time it was a play on irony that was really offensive to the church and shocked a lot of people that were his contemporaries. And in this one here, they're using a lot of the tricks that we learned from illusions to create depth. They're using contrast and color. And these are illusionary murals from 1400s to the 1700s called quadrata. And they often show architectural elements, people, or skies as ways to open up spaces. So the picture is on the left is a dome by Andrea Pozzo in 1685. And the picture on the right is by Andrea Mantegna, who actually inspired the Palazzo del Te that we saw in the previous slide. He was friends with Julio Romano, and they were apparently in on the joke of playing with our perception. This is contemporary work by French artist Pierre Delavie. He actually prints canvas on top that fits over the top of existing buildings. And this one's in Paris. You can see this next one. He allows some parts to pull out, but here's the trick of it. He's basically hanging these pictures over the buildings. And this is a great one to point out the illusion, a leftward upward bias that we have in our eyesight. So you can't really see where the seams line up, but actually if you look all the way to the right, you can see that's where the illusion breaks down the most. And this last one, both Ania and I were like, wow, what is happening here? But I believe that these are mirrors that he hung on a building that are strategically placed to confuse us all. So Ania, I also was really interested to hear about her expertise and some of the things that she's run into. And so with all of that, can you tell us a little bit more about examples of illusion in architecture?
Thank you. Thanks, Ashley. Well, I can. I'm not an expert, but I can definitely talk about the fact that, you know, looks are definitely certainly deceiving. And this is obviously the master building of perception, which is Parthenon. Despite its appearance, there are very few straight lines or right angles. And this temple appears to be rectilinear, but in fact, it seems like this seemingly straight lines are usually curves. So the 8 columns of the facade they're seen as perfectly regular array. And this is achieved by really deliberately introducing subtle distortions, which are being called optical refinements. And in example, to avoid the apparent sagging effect of the base of the facade, it is curved and it's higher at its center, just marginally, than the corners. So here is this diagram E, right in the on the left side of the image in the center. And this diagram shows how we actually do see the facade of the Parthenon. Diagram F demonstrates that what we would see, of course, exaggerated, if there was no optical corrections used. And diagram G shows the Parthenon facade is actually constructed, of course, with quite a bit of exaggeration to counter the optical distortion. So then we can see Parthenon as the image E or the graphic E. So, of course, you all likely or know that shape of the shaft, it is also altered. There's a swelling in the middle of the shaft and it tapers towards the top. And the corner columns are slightly wider to counteract another visual effect. Without this adjustment, they would appear thinner than the inner columns. The columns are not located in the exact same distance from each other, the outer ones being slightly closer together, and neither are the columns precisely vertical. They slope very, very subtly inwards. And so these refinements required a quite remarkable degree of precision and understanding of geometry and nuances of human perception. So it is said that designed to correct the illusion, I think it's still something that is being researched. But I wanted to maybe focus on another aspect of perception that I thought it was interesting to mention, the influence of the Greek architecture. Ashley mentioned the anchoring bias, which means that a person might excessively focus on an initial information offered to make subsequent judgment during decision making. So I wanted to extend this meaning of anchoring bias into architecture. And I'm not sure if this is correct, but I'm quite interested in the fact that once the value of anchor is set, all future negotiations and arguments are discussed in relationship to the anchor. So in that thinking, Parthenon, and especially Greek column, is acting as that anchor. It is interesting to think that a Greek column as a symbol and the fact that the reading of it remained the same regardless of time, culture, material, and structure. And depending on the context and which order is used or reused, they represent stability, tradition, authority, status, wealth, knowledge, and justice. and they are also expressions of taste and style. So classical column lends prestige and legitimacy to the buildings and its owners. And fake decorative columns apply to elevations of buildings, pretend importance. I took it a little bit farther, and I think the column as a symbol, its perceived value is so embedded within our collective memory and understanding that it left the realm of architecture and is also sending a message of status and knowledge in a graphic. So it became a very much so a cliche symbol that serves everyone from, you know, world-class universities to small-town construction companies. And the message it sends, it's almost always the same: trust, stability, reality, and class. So I wanted to point out the logo on the right side. The shaft of a column is replaced with a graphic of a tooth, definitely a tapped dentist. And on the left, this is University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign's logo.
And I thought this was so interesting. Again, just how our biases can almost act as illusions throughout long periods of time. And I was curious to know if there was something similar to that that's closer to either our physical bodies or like in our homes. And so, Ania, is there anything that you could say would be close to us that we don't question our interactions with?
Yeah, I think in my practice, I like to question how we behave within the space and how do we subconsciously analyze or read the space, and how, what is interesting about the classical Greek column that is sending us a message, but I think as a general public, we really do not question its appeal. And I think in our current times, we more and more question our reality and how we live, probably more than ever before. So the last few slides, I think it's gonna, you know, taking us a little bit to our domestic space and maybe bring light on misconceptions or a set way of thinking about the example of very familiar, very domestic, and very common bed. So I wanted to bring this essay by Beatrice Colomina, The Century of the Bed, and she's asking us to seriously think about what bed is today. When we think of bed, we think of sleep, and that our beds support that exact activity, a place where we can relax and get our 7 to 8 hours of rest. What does it really mean? Colomina states that sleep is maximized in order to maximize productivity. She brings to attention that it is hard work to actually sleep, and there is the entire industry developed to assist us in that activity, like pharmaceuticals, especially engineered pillows or ergonomic mattresses. She takes it even farther than that. She states that sleep became so important for the performance and economy of individual companies and a culture that now bed-like pads are part of the office environment. So even UIC's student center had few of them installed last year. And on the other hand, she states that our domestic space of the bedroom and bed itself became more and more influenced by work. So to illustrate this idea, she brings up Hugh Hefner, who famously almost never left his bed. He moved his office into his bed in the 1960s. It was here in Chicago. And the bed is outfitted with a small hi-fi, telephone, filing cabinets, bar, microphone, dictaphone, video cameras, headphones, TV, breakfast table, work surfaces, and control for all the lighting fixtures, along with projectors. And the bed also rotates in order to make an easy access to all those individual items placed around the bed. And as it states, it changes one room or divides one room into several rooms depending on position of the bed. The next quite famous example is Richard Neutra's bedroom, who started working at the moment he woke up. And Neutra's bed was also outfitted with phones, with telecom lines to his office, call bells, folding drafting tables, storage compartments and variety of equipment. So he could use every minute of work from early morning to late night. He oftentimes actually also held meetings in his bed and communicated with his assistants from that particular bed. So Colomina states that to lie down is not to rest, but to move. Our beds are now sites of action. Our beds are most likely all equipped with small devices like laptops and phones for reading, writing, working, watching, listening, entertainment, and eating. In that sense, can we still think of a bed as purely an object for sleeping, or should we redefine its function as something entirely different? Is this another misconception that we are overlooking, even so close to us? So perhaps to finalize tonight, when in bed, think about your interactions when you're actually lying down in it, but also to bring us back to the kind of very visual perception. Please turn off the lights and look at the room, and you realize that you can't see the color, and you only can see gray, black, and white shades. So since there's no light, human color perception goes away. Thank you. We hope we entertained you.
Thank you both. Does anyone have any questions for Ania and Ashley?
Oh, sorry, my cat.
Hi, Ashley. Nice to meet you. Hi, Ania. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
It wasn't a question. It was just a kind of a footnote. It showed that one video that was from San Francisco from the Exploratorium.
Mm-hmm.
A number of years ago, I had a kind of deep dive when I was consulting to the Detroit Science Center. It's the first one of these science, not a museum, but like a science center like that. And it was started by Frank Oppenheimer, who's the brother of J. Robert Oppenheimer, like the father of the atomic bomb. Apparently also a brilliant physicist. Was during the kind of Red Scare, he was quite sympathetic to communists, and got so he couldn't even teach like high school physics. And so he went to San Francisco and sort of started it. But the only reason I wanted to say is I happen to have a thing here. They had for years, a kind of artist in residence program where an artist would come and design an exhibit. And sometimes they were perceptual, sometimes they were on other things. But I thought it was an interesting thing where it had a kind of, some of that, it had that institution has a long history of finding interface between art and some of these perceptible science effects.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I didn't know exactly that's the story behind that space. I enjoyed the video. Obviously, it was quite strange, but there's quite numerous sites like that you can go and visit. And also that video from the 1950s, the actual experiments of AIMS's, that video is quite interesting too, because it shows this giant structures that explain this very small visual effect that had to be built. So I thought it was quite interesting too. And we were watching too with 4UG, The Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind by Michel Gondry. And so we're kind of looking at some of those visual effects that were applied in there too.
Great.
Quick question about what you guys called the sort of session, how to not perceive. I think a lot of what we saw was how we perceive, but I kind of expected that you guys would maybe talk about whether it's important, or I guess if we're able to somehow remove some of those preconceptions in order to sort of see a different way. I'm just wondering how you guys came up with the title and if that was something that you guys were thinking of.
Yeah, good question. Well, the title was maybe an earlier version of what we actually presented, but yeah, actually we can remove a lot of those things. We are conditioned to our brains make errors, our perception makes errors, and that's why we actually biased, and that's how we perceive our world. So it actually not only goes from the visual or sensory understanding, but also really is applied or kind of has its consequences in the way we perceive the world.
I would also,
so maybe on the note is to kind of question what you perceive and how not to, make not to believe in certain things.
yeah, I would add too that some of the illusions, once you know the trick of it, then you can't unsee it from the original illusion. So you might be tricked, but then once you know what's happening, just like you would in a magic trick, then you can't overlook and you see right through the illusion. So I think in that way, just like visual illusions, knowing gives you the power back to be able to alter your behavior. That also occurs with heuristics, where if you know that you are going to be more worried about people, what they think about you, then you might be able to let that go a little bit more. If you know that's like a fallacy or like a cognitive bias that you have.
Yeah, I like the example that Ashi showed, one of the first ones with the just two circles, one with the light from the top, and another row of several ones. And depending of, if you left to right or right to left reader, you would perceive them differently. So it's also kind of cultural in a sense.
I know you guys sort of jumped through, and actually I've never met you, so I was just wondering if your background is somehow in
psychology.
Okay, and how do you, do you think that sort of influences the way, I'm sure it influences, but can you sort of, are you aware of how it might influence your approach to design, or as you kind of go through studio projects, let's say? I'm just curious how it might play a role in that.
That's funny that you asked that, because that was part of my motivation for using heuristics, because especially that one happens all the time in studio, where your first idea that you come across, you just think is amazing, and it's really hard to move away from it once you have settled on it. And so for me, I think sometimes when I get into the weeds and I don't want to let something go, I can kind of remind myself, okay, there's always a ton of options out there. Maybe you're just settling on one thing and having a hard time adjusting. But I also like to play with perception. Right now I'm working on this project where I'm like trying to blend a banana and a Taurus together, and perceptively they look really similar, but they kind of challenge each other. So I think I'm really invested in how we see things and perceive, and how to undo that or mess with that feeling.
Yeah, I was also interested in the visual, the graphics, the visual illusions, especially by the Japanese researcher, because I think that there's a way to learn how to crack the code, right? It's all about colors and the sequence of the colors. And I thought it was quite interesting to maybe apply it into architectural drawing, or maybe have an exercise that would apply some of those optical illusions into representation in architecture. Because also another thing is that some of them work in all the scales, some of them work on a specific scale. But I think it's really mostly about how the colors are being paired with each other. Actually, I can see Thomas turn on his camera, and I was actually talking about you a lot, because I know that you are the one who is interested in some of those perspectival illusions, and you are also researching that, right?
I think no more than like any other architect, I'd actually place more emphasis on Zago as someone who I think really has turned it kind of into a part of his pedagogy. I like learning the tricks. And I guess my question to you all would be, like from a pedagogical standpoint, like, is it important to be, you know, teaching students Panofsky and kind of maybe other writers who make it important to rationalize, intellectualize like the psychological component relative to the visual one. I mean, there's so many other senses to take on in architecture. Like, why today is it still important to maintain that vision is like sense number one?
It's a good question.
Yeah, I think we focus on the vision in this presentation, maybe more than other senses. And obviously because we're in visual kind of way of, but I think from my standpoint, thinking about individual elements of architecture and space in relationship to human behavior is something that I was quite interested in going into this and kind of see how we do perceive certain things and how some of those things we don't question, even though they do behave differently, in fact, or we behave around those elements differently.
I would add too that what's really curious about the brain is that we're always filling in information. So kind of like, again, so our visual systems, I do think, have a hierarchy. Not to say that they are higher up on, you know, in the processing than like sound, but the level of complexity in the visual system is so much higher than the other senses that sometimes I wonder if there would be some really good experiments out there about how we can be
I wonder how a
visually.
chef would feel about like you saying something like that. I wonder if this is like, there's disciplinary bias as well.
Again, so okay, think about that onion experiment where you have a blindfold and then you buy an onion and it tastes like an apple. So
right,
I don't know, like we can like split hairs there, but it's interesting that if things don't match our eyes, we have a kind of a confusion with our other senses.
Agreed. No, I'm on team vision for sure. I guess I'm just also curious about like the tone of, especially Ania's swerve into I think objects and like symbolism and signs. I think you know, it might suggest that what you two are kind of after with this conversation is trying to project ways of moving beyond vision into, I guess, what people, I guess, Zago, correct me if I'm wrong, refer more to as like seeing, right? Like different ways of seeing.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's funny. The other thing, and it's the font you use on the visual perception slide was almost exactly like the cover of Rudolf Arnheim's Art and Visual Perception. For some reason, like, I don't know if you know that book, Ashley, but you might find it interesting. A famous like art theorist, Gestalt scientist, I guess, and explains all sorts of ideas about reading of forms and dynamisms and colors and you know, these terms like anisotropic space, that up, down, left, and right may be the same in geometry, but in architecture or in art it's completely different. So it is, yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you know, it's also, there's always that fine line. Like I always forbid my students from looking at MC Escher, and I always think there's a line between novelty tricks and using it in order to shape possible range of effects.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that maybe gets into the kind of then the cultural, you know, the form and perception as cultural questions, I guess, as opposed to sort of demonstrations of possibilities.
Yeah, actually, the novelty trick. So I thought that was interesting from this conversation, that I always thought about those visual illusions as novelty tricks, but they're actually very much so part of the research or psychologists that actually, you know, every single image that we saw actually invented and studied and analyzed, which I thought it was quite interesting that now this is some kind of part of our all common understanding. And it also seems like that kind of novelty trick But it's interesting how that had to be discovered.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. I was doing a class where we were looking at color a few years ago, and some of it was looking at the Joseph Albers, which is a lot about these colors being different in different contexts. And in the middle of teaching it, that the dress meme came out. Do you know that one?
Yes.
The striped dress, and half the people see it as
yeah.
black and white, everyone else sees it as blue and gold or something like that. I go, there you go, ripped from today's headlines.
I think that's also quite a popular one on the internet. The dress one. Yeah.
Right. Well, interesting. Tip of the iceberg.
Yes.
I'd love to go on more. I gotta skip to studio.
I know everybody has to get to the studio, but thank you so much. It was really rich. And we appreciate if anybody has ideas for their own Two How-To, please let me know, because we can, I really enjoy having this window into something else for a little bit. So thanks everybody.
My recommendation would be like next one, have Andy Zago do like smell, right? Like visual, like tie his hands behind his back.
I think two grad students, Alexandra and Shamsat, can do. They're planning a harp electric guitar duet.
Love it.
They could come on and do that.
That's good. That's good.
All right. Well, I'm expecting the emails now to get this planning happening.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Anya.
Bye.
Thank you, guys.
Everyone.